Ability.
No, I mean, there's...
I think Leah Luma or Peter or someone's mics are not muted. If you could just mute there, please. So welcome everybody this afternoon. We are grateful to have you. We have a very interesting topic on the table this afternoon, where we are looking at some of the interlinkages between climate change, adaptation, and social security / social security law, and its relevance from an urban development or a city perspective. And we've got two lovely speakers, Professor Alex van den Heever. He's from Wits University, so we are extremely grateful for him joining us. Those of you reading the Daily Maverick might have seen his name a couple of times in the past. And then Professor Ademola Jegede, no stranger for the lawyers among us, a climate change law expert. He's also recovering from illness, so you might also hear when he speaks. So we are extremely grateful also to have him, and he's from the University of Venda. I can perhaps just, for those of you not familiar with the chair, although when looking at the list of participants, I think most people have either joined us in the past or are familiar with the work that we do. But at the chair, just in a nutshell, we are interested in scholarship and research around urban development, sustainability, and the law. And we focus on various aspects of this connection and nexus, if you would like to call it that. And one of it speaks to the vulnerability of people living in cities. And when we talk about social security, much of it has to do with addressing the vulnerability of people. And as we all know, climate change came to intensify many of the vulnerabilities of older persons, persons with disabilities, children, but actually all of us. And that means that we can also put pressure on a social security system such as that of South Africa. I think we further know that climate change has biophysical as well as social impacts. And that climate change, ironically so, has even been described as a human health issue. And much of the social security system also centers around securing an accessible health system. And I think we could not imagine a time more relevant to speak about this issue than now. But that's all from my side. So welcome from the side of the chair, the CLES chair of the Northwest University. And I'm handing over to Maricel. And perhaps just before I do so, I can mention, or should mention, that this initiative is fully organized by the student team of the chair. And I'm thankful for all the effort that they are putting in. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Hi, Prof. Thank you very much. I would like actually for Melandri, Miss Melandri Steenkamp, a PhD researcher for the chair, or LLD researcher for the chair, to first introduce the CLES critical conversation. So Melandri, if you will.
Thank you, Maricel. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome again. As Maricel mentioned, my name is Melandri Steenkamp, and I will be telling you a little bit about the CLES Critical Conversation series. So this is the third year of the existence of the series, and which is also known as the CLES Cup of Convo, and the second year of hosting the event online. So the aim of the CLES Critical Convo series is to engage in scientific discussions with people from all facets of society. So from academia, civil society, NGOs, government, and otherwise. The event is open to everyone wishing to ask questions on the topic, to intervene with examples, or to share from their own experience. So the theme of today's convo is social security law as an adaptation measure to climate change in South African cities. What can be done? And this is an invitation to actively participate in the discussion today. So I will now hand over to Maricel, who will share some housekeeping rules and will introduce our two speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Melandri, for that brief introduction on what CLES is. And it is my great honor to introduce our speakers. Firstly, we have Prof Alex van den Heever, who presently holds the Chair of Social Security Systems Administration and Management Studies at the University of Witwatersrand, or WITS. And he has worked in areas of health economics and finance, public finance, as well as social security in various capacities over the course of his career. And I think if you look at the program, you'll see that he has a very extensive CV, and it's a great honor to have him here. Our second speaker is Prof Ademola Jegede, who is currently a professor of law working at the School of Law at the University of Venda. And he's been a research visitor internationally, and focuses on the interface of climate change with the rights of vulnerable groups and general international human rights law. So I think it'll be an interesting discussion to also see how these speakers also interpret the topic, which I think is very interesting. But if you'll allow me, I'll quickly just want to go through some basic house rules. Firstly, we ask please that all participants switch off their cameras to save data, and also keep their microphones off until you are asked to speak, and also make sure that you stay muted throughout, just so that we don't have background noise disturbing the speakers in their presentations. You are welcome to please use the chat function to post questions or share ideas during the discussion, and this is particularly important for the question and answer session. And as this is an academic discussion, please be respectful and civil towards each other and also the speakers. As you will see here, these are the basic Teams icons that you'll be using. So I think most of us are in fact comfortable with these functions. And then it's also important to just note that by participating in this event, you are consenting to the session being recorded. And we have to generate a list of participants. But if you are uncomfortable having your name included on this list, please email either myself or Dr. Nicolene Steyn. We'll add our email addresses to the chat. But for now, I think let's get into the business. And the reason why we're all here today. And I think Prof van den Heever will speak first to the introduction of social security law and the possibilities it holds in South African cities, followed by Prof Ademola Jegede, who will speak to how social security law can be used as an adaptation measure to climate change in South African cities, whereafter we will have an interactive discussion. Prof van den Heever, you're welcome.
Thank you, and good afternoon to everybody. I'm going to be sharing my some slides, but maybe just to give a brief introduction on the issue. I think it's quite a tricky set of relationships that are proposed in the topic, because typically social security systems tend to be fairly, in terms of income support, tend to be pretty national and quite distant from communities. So the question of the relationship between a social security system and what happens within and how it can impact on city development is a very interesting issue. And it largely speaks to the institutional frameworks that we develop for governing our different parts of society, both the social security system as well as cities and various subsystems within them, and how they connect to each other. This is not a very straightforward problem, and is currently done very badly in South Africa. And so it's an area where there's a need for consistent reform at an institutional level in order to be able to get coherence and to get effectiveness out of our resource allocation from the state, as well as focus out of our legislative frameworks. So just note that when I refer to an institutional framework, I'm referring to laws as well as physical organizations, regulators, etc. Those all form part of the sort of structural framework that that has, let's say, within a government perspective or a governance perspective, have specific goals to that they must achieve. And so part of my discussion, therefore, will be talking to, first of all, what I mean by governance in these systems. Look a bit at how the social security system is being looked at going forward, not how it is now. I'll talk to a bit about how it is. It's far from desirable as it stands at this point. And then I'll talk to the whole issue of cities themselves and sustainable governance, and how one might basically get these different systems to talk to each other. So I'm just going to share my screen. Can you see that? Is that visible to everybody?
Yes, thank you, Prof.
Okay, so the topic was social security law as an adaptation measure to climate change in South African cities. What can be done? That's the overriding topic. So a lot of what I refer to as sort of I see the social security as a system which is essentially governed by laws and legal frameworks, and therefore a lot of what I will be talking about at a systems level applies to that that understanding. So firstly, when we look at social security systems, the question is, what problems are we trying to solve? You've got a social context and you've got an economic context. So your social context and your economic context have a set of interrelated features which impact on each other. Within social security, you're very often looking at this problematic issue of social contingencies, which is stuff things that can go wrong. So you can fall into poverty, you can lose your income, you become old, you're a vulnerable child, you have children, etc. All of these are certain instances, certain contingencies that themselves contribute to vulnerability at the level of a household, for instance. Now, social contingencies, when they occur, have an impact on the distribution of income. So if you're sick and you can't work and lose income, then, or if you lose your job and lose income, that impacts on the distribution of income itself. And that distribution of income has economic effects if the social contingencies are distributed in a way that creates a sort of a structural set of winners and losers in society, so that when bad luck hits, you're permanently hit, and you can't claw your way out of the situation you're in. So many parts of society are in that, where a social contingency basically drags them down, and thereafter there are a number of forces that keep you down. So this is what social security systems are meant to try and address. They're meant to try and look at the overriding economic context, the feedback effects between distributional features of the system, as well as the contingencies. So you might think of social security as purely about dealing with somebody who needs a social grant, or needs some income support, or perhaps requires a service such as healthcare. But part of the impact, the second order impacts, are the distributional features of society that themselves have quite a lot of feedback effects that increase exposure to social contingencies for many people. So you'll see many people who are very, very wealthy. That means when something bad happens to them, even they lose their job, they become ill, it has no impact on their ability to survive and to prosper. So for them, they're actually insulated, but for probably sort of just over 90% of any society, but in particular South African society, probably 95% would be vulnerable to social contingencies. So even people earning reasonable incomes are vulnerable to severe reversals that can have systemic effects on at a societal level, ultimately when everything is writ large. So the purpose of a comprehensive system of social security is to effect positive feedback effects, to allow social and economic context to promote increasing levels of social well-being. That's the purpose of a comprehensive system of social security. Well, in South Africa, we don't have one. we have a very partial system. It's highly fragmented. Only very small groups of people are supported in very partial and mediocre ways. So in reality, we do not get the scale out of our system of social security to actually cause these positive feedback effects at a systemic level. And this is potentially a contributor toward systemic inequality, poverty, but also in unemployment, as it structurally affects the way our economy is organized. So, so the problem that we actually need to solve is very much an institutional one, and this is where I certainly want to kind of show the relationships. Any comprehensive system of social security is very large in reality. It involves many different subsystems. So a social security system includes both public and private sector arrangements. It includes, so for instance, private pension funds are typically form part of an overriding comprehensive social security response, as are your social grant systems. So if you're assuming social grants are the only part of the social security system or public health care, you're wrong. They're all just subsystems of an overriding system, which means when you're looking at the issue of comprehensive social security, you're looking at multiple arrangements, multiple pieces of legislation for which you require policy development that is coherent, that can deal with these sort of functions across all of these different organizations. The problem in South Africa at the moment is that many of these institutions are siloed in multiple departments. So around about 5 different departments cover what would be understood as social security. That includes functions that fall under National Treasury, fall under the Department of Social Development, the Department of Transport, the Department of Health, and the Department of Employment, or what used to be Department of Labor. So but technically it would also include housing, which is typically not an income transfer system, but in many countries, social housing is an important part of a social security system, and that is non-existent in South Africa. We have housing policy which doesn't deal with protecting people who are effectively losing access to housing and to shelter because of a loss of income. And that is a very vital part of protecting people. It's also in our constitution, and it's not adequately protected by our institutions and an institutional framework. So I've basically broken up the issues that need to be resolved. If you want to have a coherent framework involving multiple systems, you essentially need to have harmonized policy formation, harmonized financing frameworks, and integrated governance and accountability frameworks, which is basically your set of institutions, including your legal frameworks. And this will be really governing your redistributive schemes, your social insurance schemes, and your private arrangements that need to be regulated to achieve certain social protection goals. And then you need a harmonized administration framework. So notice I use this term harmonized. By harmonized, I mean that it is not all controlled by one organization, which is not possible in any multidimensional complex system such as social security. It has to involve many different actors, many different frameworks that all need to be sort of coordinated to achieve some sort of harmonized goal. So harmonization means you've got to think about 2 things. You've got to think about coordination, and you've got to think about integration. Coordination is when autonomous organizations need to cooperate in some way. And integration is when you kind of hardwire them together in some way. But you need to basically decide on when you're dealing with a cooperative framework or an integrated framework, and where you're dealing with cooperation between different parts of government and private sector organizations, you often need an institutional structure that will actually institutionalize that coordination. And needless to say, that's pretty much missing in much of South Africa today in these complex institutions. So in the case of social security and the problems that it's dealing with, you're dealing with complexity. And this is something that's also shared with the problem when you're dealing with city development. And I'll go into that in more depth. But the physical shaping or design of spatial arrangements in society is incredibly complex. And we also have deeply siloed structures along those lines. So there's no cooperation, coordination, and coherent thinking that occurs around spatial development, although you may think it is, but I'll problematize it later. But there's most certainly no coordination, cooperation, and integration with, for instance, the potential that social security systems have to impact on city development and organization. With some very key areas of social security completely missing where there is a natural link, such as, for instance, land policy, land regulation, and housing, social housing. So just to kind of complete the point on when I'm talking about social security subsystems, which applies to any state subsystem that you've got. So just to clarify what I mean, it's a system is an organized collection of parts or subsystems that work together as part of a mechanism or a highly integrated or interconnected network to accomplish some overriding goal. So the idea of having an overriding goal is quite critical when you're talking about a system. There's a goal, there's interrelatedness, they're not all one organization necessarily, but you do have to have some sort of interconnecting structure, some structure that integrating mechanism, coordination mechanism. So complex systems, which include social systems, are actually made up of subsystems that are arranged in hierarchies and integrated to accomplish the overall goal of the overall system. So there's an overriding system and there are subsystems. Each subsystem has its own boundaries and includes various inputs, processes, outputs, and outcomes that are geared to accomplish an overall goal for the subsystem. So complex systems usually interact with their environments and can be regarded as open systems. In other words, they actually react to their systems. So every organization is therefore a subsystem, even where they form part of another subsystem, which directs their outcomes towards an overriding goal. So an overriding system is therefore made up of a nested cascade of subsystems, each of which contribute to the overall system goal by achieving their subsystem goals, each of which interact to a greater or lesser extent with other subsystems. So I've got this sort of image of what I'd be talking about. The sort of green area is your overriding system, of which you have a kind of wider set of systems, all of which have kind of more localized subsystems within them, and they have to interact. Now, the problem in policy development is that there isn't necessarily coherence in the determination of goals, which in some terminology refers to sort of public value objectives that you determine in your system missions, your organization missions that need to be created. If you don't have coherence in the development of those missions at all the different levels of the system, then you are going to have incoherent outcomes. Now, this isn't a simple thing to organize. You do have to have some focus in the way you understand your wider system. What kind of group of organizations, institutions, and legal frameworks need to be clustered together and seen as part of an overriding system? Well, if you see what happens within government at the moment, it's a very loose collection of different autonomous organizations that might have very strong relationships with some other functions, but they tend to be kind of coordinated to a degree through sort of cluster structures of government policy decision-making within national government. And these cluster arrangements really don't integrate or coordinate. They're kind of a loose discussion on policy where people can sort of interact on related policies, but really they are not coordinating, cooperating, and designing interrelated structures that make systems work together. That's our problem, is we do not have subsystems, systems that actually coordinate and cooperate, and people don't really think about it. They don't. It's not something that is necessarily becomes part of a structured discussion within government, which makes it very difficult to set these up. So in essence, all you're doing at the end of the day is trying to herd a bunch of autonomous sheep, cats, more like herd a bunch of cats, easier to herd sheep. But an autonomous structure is one which is kind of thinking it has its own inner direction. So it is kind of thinking organizations and structures that you're dealing with rather than sheep, which are easy to coordinate but are unthinking. So but if you've got multiple systems that are fairly decentralized in the way they're operating, which gives them a lot of autonomy as to how they organize and self-organize to deal with their mission, and they are still part of a reasonably coherent, wider system with clear goals, you can get a lot of power in the achievement of your objectives. But if you leave the system disorganized, where all of these autonomous structures basically pursue goals that do not coordinate with the overriding system goals, then you're just going to have incoherence. And that's pretty much, I'd say, where we stand, that it's very difficult to get cooperation and coordination out of different parts of the system. So now to deal specifically with social security. So here's the kind of the range of issues that you might have to deal with. So on the right-hand side, I've got listed the contingencies I've mentioned, the things that you need to that create problems for people, both from a life cycle perspective, as well as things that just happen to you by accident. So they're broken into three broad areas, which is lack and loss of income by breadwinners. That's a really big thing that can impact on a family. Any lack or loss of income by the key breadwinner. So somebody in that family who isn't a breadwinner, who might have a contingency that is similar, but doesn't lose income for the family, won't have the same impact. So the kinds of things that fall into this category are old age, becoming old. Now in South Africa, we have laws which effectively allow our employers to fire us at the age of 65. Many countries in Europe don't allow that. They disallow that. And what that means is that if you don't have access to some structure that can create some sort of saving for you for upward of 35 years, in which you can't get it, in which you have no certainty of access to employment, despite the fact you are entirely employable and have a working brain and can contribute, you are basically structured out of employment and lose your income. So that's one contingency that's a problem. Part of it is made by our laws, and part of it is the fact of getting old. Unemployment, disability, illness, maternity, death of a breadwinner, all of those can involve lack or loss of income by a breadwinner. Then you've got lack and loss of financial support by dependents, which can include family instability and distress through inadequate income, for instance. So and then you've got a third category, sort of affordable access to services and insurance. So you might be an income earner, but if you do not have institutional access to some form of insurance mechanism because you've got an ability to pay, then you lose access to healthcare, rehabilitation and return to work type services, labor activation, social support, decent shelter, all of those things impact. So there's an interrelationship between this blue area and the other areas as well. So they kind of have a circular effect. So there's a wide range of things that are quite specific contingencies, broad issues that involve basically loss of access to finances and financial support of one form or another. And these are typically broken into three areas of social security. One would be social services and in-kind benefits. So your access to free services, social services, support services, healthcare, free healthcare, etc. You can have social assistance, which is a financial transfer. And you've got social insurance, which you contribute to and get support from if the contingency occurs. Now, the problem in the social security system is that virtually we break up our system according to contingency very often, and we break it up according to the kind of branch of social security that we have. So social services tend to be run by completely different organizations than social assistance, and social insurance are run by different departments. And in some cases, some things that should be social insurance and that require a regulatory approach, such as our financial service oversight supervision for pensions, disability protection, life insurance, etc., health insurance, all of those are distributed to departments and functions within government that don't have any kind of social security focus. So these systems don't talk to each other at the level of social security. And one of the consequences of that is that we have very, very poor policy. It's very difficult to create policy in organizations that are siloed, because some of these require that you have holistic policies that are developed. And every time a very siloed organization tries to create a holistic policy, they start to step on the toes of some other department who has some component of that function under their responsibility, and they can be an obstruction to the process going forward, depending on the vested interests that they are actually reflecting. So this does represent a very big problem, is that curing the problems and the fragmentation in the social security system really requires a complete revision of its institutional framework. And only if that happens will that system be able to talk to the different parts of our society, where you can articulate the social security system with support. So the relationship, for instance, between decent shelter, which is a critical part of social security, and also city development and organisation, quite aside from a bunch of other things, which I'll go into. If you can't talk coherently to cities and their development, how can the social security system ensure that one of the most fundamental rights that we have, which is access to shelter, is actually done in some sort of coherent way? And we see it on our streets every day. We are not solving this problem. We see children on the streets every day, which shows our social security system does not work, and that our cities don't work. We've got people living in desperation, and we have people who have to travel and use up large parts of their income just to get to work. All of those things are very much part of the failure of our distributional systems and our organized systems of support, as well as the way in which we develop our spatial development of cities, and the way we organize how people live and work and the environments they're in. How all of that is actually thought about. I'm not going to go into this in any depth, but basically there's going to be a green paper coming out on social security reform, comprehensive social security reform, and it involves looking at all of these different subsystems and how they can be coordinated through a restructuring of the institutional frameworks, which, if not done, means that the social security system will be in permanent disarray going forward. And it's important to note that the South African social security system largely reflects the pre-apartheid organizational structure and functional distribution between departments. So it is absolutely insane that we still have an institutional framework that was designed for apartheid operating in a period, in the current period. Now, just to point out why the old apartheid system was so fragmented, was because South Africa largely, when it was focused principally on whites, in which there was almost guaranteed employment, largely achieved social security protection, principally through that employment structure. So your medical scheme cover, your pension systems, all of those things protected you fundamentally. And then there'd be some dropouts who can be captured within a system of social assistance, which was privileged towards whites. It paid out much larger sums of money. So the social security system then didn't actually become adaptive, because it wasn't really dealing with the comprehensive requirements of South Africa as a whole. So now you go into the 21st century with that organization that was really designed for a minimalist social protection regime, because it didn't really need it, given who basically put government and kept them in power. Now you actually have to deal with the real problems of society, and that institutional framework is completely and totally inadequate. But the problem that it has is that it generates its own vested interest support to keep it going. And this is always the problem with legacy systems, is that you do have to deal in transitioning organizations and institutional frameworks. You have to deal with the vested interests in public institutions as well as private institutions that actually that create what's called a policy lock. They prevent any kind of transition to a new environment. So it requires that there is a very careful process of moving from one institutional set of institutions to a new one. And it's really proved to have been very difficult for government to actually make this transition, because in itself it's been quite confused about its objectives. It's been in disarray at the executive level of government, which means that actually dealing with complex social problems in South Africa has been difficult for government to prioritize and to do properly. It means that it's quite easy for the different vested interest stakeholders to disrupt a reform process and to prevent it from actually moving in a direction which might create uncertainty for some of those stakeholders, but hugely improve the circumstances of people in South Africa. So largely what this system looks at is it does create a set of organizations, not a centralization, not a centralized structure for social security, multiple structures, but ones that are coordinated so that you can deal with cross-organization coordination and integration. So a key component is the establishment of a social security board that would be a supervisory structure that would separate the executive of government from the social security institutions. So you don't have ministers appointing the people to run these organizations, but you have a structure that can operate across autonomous organizations from a supervisory perspective, which can create strategic coherence. So you've got like the SASSA, Social Security Agency that we have at the moment. There are proposals for basically a basic national social security fund to deal with contributory social security. And you have a regulatory framework for the private funds that are basically doing the equivalent. They form part of your social insurance framework. And so you're harmonizing them, you're giving them social protection objectives, even though they're private. So what they're getting attached to from a regulatory perspective is a set of goals that have to be achieved through the regulatory framework, through the legislation that gets established. So the Social Security Board oversees that. Then you have various agencies that are responsible for transversal functions, many of which would also fall under the board as well. And the Social Security Board therefore becomes a very key separate institution from each of these agencies that provides its coordination function as well as an integrating function. So I'm not going to go into too much depth, just to point out that there is multiple tiers to the social security system, but if you do not organize it in this way, it can't communicate with other sectors.
Sorry, Prof.
So yeah, you're running out of time.
5 minutes left. Yes, thank you.
Okay, so I'll run through it very quickly. So a guiding principle is the idea of producing a system that is of what's called sustainable governance, which refers to enabling multi-actor institutional frameworks beyond the traditional notion of government. So it's capable of driving the visioning, planning, engaging of stakeholders, the implementation of and continuous policy assessment of the framework that's established. So governance determines who has power, who makes decisions, how other players make their voice heard, and how account is rendered. So essentially you're dealing with a complex institutional framework that starts to form part of a set of systems with goals. So just to point out, now looking very quickly, as I'm out of time, on the sort of spatial issues. Your spatial development of any city is as complex as what I've described within social security. And spatial development in South Africa is also hugely fragmented. So it's quite easy to draw fancy pictures about what one wants. But transport systems, housing regulation, infrastructure development, transport, all of those things are critical features of a sustainable living environment. And basically you've got to, as well as with the rest, you've got to kind of, with the social security system, you've got to deal with an institutional design that coordinates policy development and implementation at this level. So I'm very short on time, so I'm really just going to focus on a couple of issues, just how to deal with the fundamental problem of decision making in complexity. This is the structure, for instance, of the Gauteng province, where you'll have the Premier's office, the provincial treasury, kind of overseeing sectoral departments, supposedly being coordinated by COGTA, in which there's some coordination between the different municipal structures. province has to coordinate with all of these, plus it also has to coordinate at a national level. Theoretically, it should have an integrated impact, but there's no integrating mechanism of any substance at this. So the idea of actually having an integrated approach between social security and spatial planning is not there. Plus, just getting the job of spatial planning right is not there, because the different provincial departments are siloed themselves and they don't really have an integrating policy-making structure. So I'm going to finish with this because of the time. If just there's one or two other remarks I'd make, but essentially what's required is the idea of an integrating multidisciplinary structure for spatial development, which, if that is strong and it's putting together the brain of spatial planning and decision making, you separate that function from your implementing agents and implementing partners. And but you've got to basically have a structure that is really thinking through the policy and is the home for integrated design and policy. You can then start to implement a far more superior strategic spatial planning policy than you can at the moment, where essentially we have a very large body and a very small brain that is looking at the multiplicity of problems that we have to deal with at a city level. And in terms of a sort of guiding vision, I take it from the sort of 5 qualities that came from the book from The Well-Tempered City, which I think is really good, which refer to sort of cities require coherence, circularity, which is about making sure that we don't have a sort of a linear structure for the way in which we produce and dispose of things, that we recycle, resilience, community and social networks, which have to be the focus, compassion for society, and all of these need to be built into the way we design, engineer, and operate. This is a multidisciplinary problem, but it requires institutions that coordinate this. It's not just good enough to have these kinds of things as wishy-washy objectives. They've actually got to be institutionalized to make a difference. So I will leave that there, and hopefully just sort of presented the problem that needs to be solved, which is really the institutional design for integrated and coordinated thinking and strong policy.
Thank you so much, Prof Venda, and we appreciate the interesting discussion, and I think the discussion will be very, very interesting following Prof Jegede's presentation. So next up we have Prof Ademola Jegede with how social security law can be used as an adaptation measure to climate change in South African cities. Thank you, Prof Jegede.
I don't know if I'm visible.
Not yet.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what is going on, but I've activated my video button. It just seems to me that I'm still not sure.
Ademola, it's Anel. We can hear you well. You are audible.
Okay, okay.
And I don't know if you're going to do a screen share. whether there's a presentation that we could then perhaps give you an indication whether we can see that, but your camera itself is not that important. There you go. We can see your slides and you are audible. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Let me just do it this way. Good afternoon, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the opportunity that you have given to me to share some thoughts on this important topic in relation to cities, social security law, and climate change. I'm going to try as much as possible to be brief. As we all know that climate change is such a global phenomenon that is challenging the way we see things, the way we do things, and the way things are. We can't afford to have business as usual approach towards solving such a global crisis of that monumental order. And I want to see that it is in that context that I really appreciate that we are thinking in terms of how to look at the whole concept of social security and see how it interfaces with this global phenomenon. And of course, it's a phenomenon that has different level of impacts for nations, and of course for different settings. And today we're focusing on advanced setting, and I think it is crucial because when we talk about the urban setting, there is three levels of vulnerability that can easily be identified when it comes to climate change, the way it works out in urban setting, which makes it a very important consideration. When we look at the urban setting, populations are increasing in our urban settings. And South Africa is not an exception to this general trend. It's just one of it. That's what happens. Talking about African-wide statistics, we see population keep on increasing in urban setting because that is where the good road is. That is where the jobs are. That is where the infrastructure is. That is where social services essentially exist more in urban setting than in other local settings. So understandably, so one can see why populations are increasing. But with these increasing populations, also kind of increase that level of vulnerability when it comes to shocks and contingencies that climate change adverse effects bring about in urban settings. Take for instance issues such as flooding or other disaster related to climate change. Its impact in urban setting is crucial because it affects all sort of contingencies which which are in such setting and not. So there is a scale of vulnerability when it comes to the increasing population that are at risk in the urban setting. And of course, the second thing is also the scale of economic, cost without adaptation. Except we begin to include adaptation as part of the, options, particularly within the context of, climate change, it becomes problematic because we may well be kind of not deferring the doomsday. So it is a reality that we must start accommodating, even as we develop future solution to the crisis. We cannot just leave it out of the discussion because failure to do so will be much more harmful on the economies of these urban settings. It will be more harmful on the populations that depend on those economies for their survival. So it makes the whole issue of economic skills so quite very important when we talk about climate change and climate change adaptation in urban setting. And I think the third, which perhaps is also the most, if not the more important, as far as I know, in this discussion, is the deficit of knowledge, which exists, which exists in that regard. The knowledge here is still scanty. It's not just scanty that which is why a discussion of this level is so gratifying that we can be having the discussion because the knowledge gap there is key. Oftentimes, policymakers don't, give on the necessary attention that this topic, deserves. Not particularly in the context of social security law. So it's like there is when we talk about this fragmentation, we can see this fragmentation too in the sense of how social security is construed in the traditional and the conventional type, which I think is not sufficient to respond to an emerging challenge of global magnitude such as climate change. And that itself is not also a problem. It's not only a problem peculiar to South African context. Even at the level of international discourse on climate change, you see the issue of adaptation has been a very controversial one because the global north sees it as a global south issue. So they rather prefer to talk about issue of mitigation, issue of how to get it financed, committing finance to it, initiating projects that aid mitigation, such as the Red Cross, the so-called CDM and all that. So they put a lot of money and a lot of effort, a lot of mouth in that regard to ensure that mitigation measures are implemented. Which rightly so it is understandable because mitigation is so key to tackling climate change. But then the issue of adaptation is so key, particularly to Africa and other, like say, low-lying highland states, because it speaks to the immediate and peculiar challenges that which populations in these nations face, which is why it's so key. It's okay to continue to ensure that it is part of the debate, even though the international direction towards climate change tends to kind of more favorable towards mitigation, and I don't have any problem with that. But then, as far as the African continent is concerned, and of course, all other disadvantage or other states that have been disproportionately affected by the adverse effect of climate change, as far as they are concerned, it's important to keep adaptation as very as a front burner is okay. So having said that, I can say that without effective nationally and locally driven adaptation, there will be serious consequences for populations in Africa, particularly populations in those living in the urban settings, as you have said. And when we talk about adaptation, as far as definition is concerned, so that we know what I'm talking about, is because I know I'm speaking with different audience. So essentially what we're looking at is that we're looking at actions, all those short-term actions that are necessary to reduce vulnerability of a system. By system, I mean a city itself is a system. So we're talking about adaptation in a way that can respond to that, to city challenges. And city is not just about its infrastructure, it's also about its population. And when we talk about population, as Professor as Professor Riley mentioned the last time when he was making his presentation in terms of how a system is. So it's also important for us to know that vulnerability of populations are so key in urban settings, particularly in our cities. So when we talk about adaptation, we are essentially talking about adaptation in terms of measures that can be taken to effectively respond to these challenges in the context of climate change and the context of social security law. There are limits to which adaptation can respond to these challenges, as we have said. But adaptation is not a solution to world climate crisis. Mitigation is makes more sense. It is important that emission be brought to that zero level, which is aspirational, but it is important that the whole world is seen to be working towards it. South Africa is not an exception. It's important that even South Africa, in terms of its energy drive, in terms of its transition, to just energy, it ensures that efforts are taken to ensure that there is a gravitation towards ensuring that carbon has no figure on it. But then the focus is on adaptation here, which I think is key, because we must kind of address immediate adverse effects of climate change, which only adaptation can easily take care of. Let me move forward. South Africa has put in place a lot of key instruments. Some of them policy papers, which kind of indicate or showcase what it intends to do in relation to climate change adaptation and all that. We look at all these documents. These documents are often scanty in terms of information in relation to social security, and the reasons are not far-fetched, but you see that the documents are often more like what they are often prepared for more of international assistance rather than how to look inward to solve the problem. So you see that at times measures meant to address some of these challenges are often very, not that feasible in the document, because these are international documents too that they present by way of communications at the level of UNFCCC discussion and other related levels. So you see that solutions are not always that inward, rather they are more or less like showcasing where the problems are and where assistance is required. So all in all, when you look at this document, you see that there is an acknowledgement of the reality that urban settings are implicated obviously in relation to climate change, and there's a need to do something substantial to address it. But then the relevance of social security law in doing that is often rare in terms of the content of this document. And when I talk about adaptation, it is important to also mention from the onset that there are so many things to do. So many things can constitute or can qualify as adaptation measures, but in reality, we're not dealing with everything here. We're just focusing on that aspect that can be dealt with, at the social security level, and the elements of adaptive capacity, include knowledge, institutional capacity, financial and technological, and all those things fit into it. But then, of course, just by way of some caveat, the focus here is on social security. And when I talk about social security, I'm a bit human rights bias. When we look at the general community defines what social security means in that context, what needs to be done. I'm referring to the United Nations General Comment number 19 of 2008, which speaks to social security, that secure protection along certain areas, including addressing lack of work-related income caused by sickness, disability, and all those other contingencies. Then beyond affordable access to health care, sufficient family support. So when you look at the adverse effect of climate change in urban setting, one can easily see that this climate scenario can easily result to some of these contingencies, in terms of the effects it has on populations, and you can, people can easily lose the job due to infrastructural, destruction or damage, maybe following after a flood, for instance, or other, natural disasters that may or may not be linked with climate change. So you see, when all those sort of things happening in the urban setting, it would affect different level and layers of vulnerability, old age, and it will make impact on whether people have income opportunity or not. So this makes the social security, right, social security paradigm a very comprehensive basis through which one can actually audit what is being done at the national level, how to the extent to which they are, you know, adaptation ready. So social security can reduce the vulnerability of a system, like I did say, it's a city population or an individual if where it is available and is adequately planned, and it is planned in such a manner that factors that possibilities that realities in, so it can be used, it can be useful as a response to it. When we look at the social security right paradigm, particularly as encapsulated by the general comment, you see how it is defined in terms of availability that has to be made available. So we what I'm saying here is that even at the national level in South Africa, there is a need for us to start, constructing, social security in this manner, to see it in this manner, at least to engage with the discussion in relation to social security with that in mind, that when we talk about availability of social security, we're not just talking about availability in the conventional sense of it. We're looking at, possible implications as such, element. As for climate change, in terms of, in terms of how the extent to which the schemes that are existing, or the schemes that are being designed, or the schemes that need to be designed, how the extent to which we can begin to make them respond to possible implications of climate change on livelihood in our urban settings. So, and also the right paradigm talks about social risk and contingencies, which has been explained by the previous speaker. But essentially what we're seeing then is that the discussion should also engage with this issue, because we're talking about different layers of vulnerability, even in urban setting. The experience there is not it's not unilayer, if I may use that word. It's not a one and straightforward experience. There are different level of vulnerabilities, even in cities. We have people, we have children, we have people who are old, we have people living with disabilities, we have people, we have mothers, we have those who have incomes, we have those who don't have incomes, all in urban set. So it's very important for us to kind of include all this as part of the discussion. We are reflecting on a possible way through which social security law can be construed to speak to the challenges associated with climate change in urban setting. Then the issue of its adequacy is also very key. We have to make it adequate, because whether we like it or not, that's what is going to happen. We already, there are challenges, as has been rightly mentioned, in relation to how it is working in South African context. But then the reality is that we need to also even question this further to see how to make it adequate in the sense of responding to these emerging challenges relating to climate adaptation. So that is okay. So I just want to close by emphasizing that in all there are state, obligations, human rights obligations that are very relevant. We know that traditionally there are three: to respect, to protect, and to fulfill. Even in the context of construing or implementing social security law, these obligations are so key to see what measures states are using to ensure that in that context the obligation to respect is not violated, and that obligation which requires states to refrain from intervening directly or indirectly. So it will be very interesting to keep assessing what measures states are doing, even in the context of climate change adaptation challenges in the city, to see whether the state is violating rights or they are, ensuring that they realize. I know it takes consistent scrutiny to do that, because oftentimes states, do this inadvertently. So the discussion should, also accommodate that, to ensure that particularly, rights are not, that negative obligations are very, adhered to. Rights are not arbitrarily or unreasonably, interfere with. Measures that people have in place to ensure that they cope with adaptation and not unnecessarily interfere with by the state, because they can, through its laws and regulations, steal out of individual and public initiatives. So it will be very important to see how state is performing its obligation to respect in the context of climate change, adaptation in urban setting, to see whether whether the space allows of public and individual initiatives, at the extent to which such initiatives, even if they are not conventional, some of them may be traditional, not be conventional, how the extent to which the state is ensuring that they are protected and they are also uh, covered and seen as such. It is very important, because
Sorry for
there's
the
also
interruption, Prof. Just 5 minutes left. Thank you.
I'm almost done. I didn't even know I was going to go that far. So obligation to protect is also very key. It's also very key in that regard, in terms of how the state, views or intervenes, in using social security law, if and how they can use social security law as an adaptation response. Yeah, I just want to say that we've been seeing innovative responses among nations that are facing challenges in relation to climate change in urban setting. We've seen how they've been responding. Some of those nations are Philippines, Brazil, and Egypt. Some of them have low island cities, coastal cities that are threatened. So they've initiated all sort of measures. Some of them, they have reformed their laws to accommodate some of these ideas that I've shared, just to ensure that social security space is not only seen or perceived conventionally, it is used in such a manner to respond to a problem as emerging as climate change. So I will end with that, please, if I'm allowed. Thank you. So, hello.
Thank you, Prof Jegede, for that interesting presentation. Melandri will now facilitate the interactive discussion.
Thank you very much for a very informative presentation, Prof Alex and Prof Ademola Jegede. Before we get to the Q&A from the audience, I would like to ask the speakers if they have any interventions or observations based on each other's presentations. Thank you.
Sorry, I could perhaps go first and just make a comment.
Yes, please, thanks.
Okay, yeah, I think that so certainly the big issues that have been pointed out in Professor Jegede's talk are important. The question really, I think, that is before us is how to organize the decision-making structures of government and society in order to be able to focus attention on these issues. I'd say that we don't necessarily lack for the for sort of wider sort of positions on what we should do. What we're lacking is really the an organized approach to institutions to make sure that we actually address these issues in a focused way. So that's really I think the key point that is quite critical. You basically need to create a relationship between the sort of the major policy area and a set of more complex objectives. And certainly my point that I'd be making is that we actually don't have the governance framework in place that allows us to have a very sophisticated set of goals that can articulate, for instance, social security policy and legal frameworks with the achievement of specific objectives, let's say at a city level and also in terms of sustainability issues at the environmental level. The articulation just isn't there. So there's a question as to whether the prior discussion is what kind of institution gets us this connection.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Alex. I cannot but agree with you more on that. As a need, you raise a very fundamental point in relation to the gap that is in existence. And I think the sooner we begin to see these issues is in that manner, in that lens, the better it will be for our cities, particularly cities in South Africa. So, it's so very important that we include that. And I can tell you that such a lens will also be far-reaching, because it's not just about these social security. We can be pretty simplistic about it, but then it's also about implementation, the resources, the design. What do we make it to look like? Is it going to be contributory? Is it going to be non-contributory? How does states, gets involved? How does private organizations, institutions and other non-state actors get involved? I think those should be part of the, broader, discussion to ensure that, the social security no paradigm is used to, respond to climate change issues in urban settings, particularly in South Africa. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Prof Jegede and Prof Heever. I see that Prof Alex' hand is up. So before I give her an opportunity to ask a question, I would like to ask, based on the presentations and based on Prof Heever's point that we do not have the appropriate legal framework or governance framework to address social security, I'd like to ask, do you see any divergence between what is theoretically possible and what will be practically possible in South Africa, especially when we consider the constraints faced by municipalities?
Sorry, you just disappeared at the end.
I apologize. I was asking whether you see any divergence between both the climate change adaptation framework and the social security framework when it comes to what is theoretically possible and that which is practically possible in South Africa, especially when we consider the constraints that municipalities currently face.
Yeah, so part of the major problem I see is that currently there doesn't really exist any structure to articulate policy at that level. So social security policy is even in a silo within its own departments where they're creating the policy. So there's no connection really to, let's say, what's happening at a municipal level, and also dealing with issues such as climate change. That becomes a goal that is a bridge too far at this point with the current structures. That's not to say that it is not possible to establish and that it shouldn't be established. At this point in time, there isn't essentially a policy-making structure that sees that as its role, as it's to get involved in that discussion. So if you went to departments dealing with social security, they would say, go and speak to somebody else. So that's the first problem, whereas in fact it is an issue that should be brought up in the sort of multidimensional impact on social security. The question is where it would connect. So, the municipal structures as they exist now are themselves in many cases performing poorly, largely due to the sort of the patronage structures that have infested many of the municipalities, and so their objectives and goals are completely distorted, and what they achieve is unrelated even to the resources they're allocated. So what we've got is actually quite a chaotic system at this point, where people aren't even necessarily focused on the goals that they have a mandate for, and they have to get that mandate pulled back. Now, in terms of what could happen if you were coordinating policy, is that you could actually start to look at different ways, because social security systems are about financial transfers, financial protection, which involve the allocation of resources and the distribution of resources. So it can have important behavioral impacts depending on how you organize it. So for instance, if there were a system which dealt with, for instance, social housing policy, and you wanted to influence how that were organized. Now, in many countries, they do it at a municipal level. Well, we're not doing anything like that at a municipal level. But if you were tying it to conditional transfers, that you wish to have municipalities do A, B, C, or D, and you give them allocations on a conditional basis from a department that has this multifaceted responsibility, they can actually start to coordinate or bring in that kind of policy into something that happens on the ground. But if you don't have these policy levers, if you don't have the policy brain that has a coherent mandate, it's got a mandate to address these issues, and that it can either compel coordination or integration through the levers, or that there is a sort of a structural approach in which people can cooperate on the same objective using their own resources. Those are the kinds of things that we need to set up. Some of those things happen over time. Some of those things can be set up at a particular level, in the medium term. Others take many years to evolve. So I think that the problem is that we're quite far away from that at this point in time. So even though we need it to be there, and that we have the resources to change things, At this point in time, the organization, the overall framework works against the achievement of more sophisticated objectives.
I can come in to answer some of the questions I see in the chat boxes relating to my presentation. Can I go ahead?
Prof Jegede, if you could just please respond on the intersections or where you see climate change adaptation making a specific contribution to social security in South Africa, and once you answer, we'll wrap that up and then start the Q&A from the audience. Thank you.
I don't know if I got it correctly, but I think what I see here is, I think the one question deals with whether climate mitigation, whether social security is applicable in the context of climate, mitigation. And I can respond to that in the sense that, oftentimes when we talk about climate mitigation, there is this purist perception of it, as though, mitigation is just so pure that, you cannot, create unnecessary problems. And often time it is not so. Climate change mitigation, particularly in the context of Africa, has its own, issues in relation to rights of vulnerable groups, issues in relation to, how they are consulted, how people's rights to land, for instance, a right to derive incentives, from these, projects, how they are also implicated. So you see essentially that climate mitigation measures can also, although they are not always intended to do so, but they can have, adverse consequences, even as, as damaging as, climate change on, vulnerable population, which is why it makes even the concept of social security to also be very useful, particularly when you are addressing different layers of vulnerabilities that are involved, by climate mitigation, programs. I can mention a lot of them because I've researched considerably on that. You see, some of these measures, impact vulnerable population, such as indigenous people, for instance. It impacts women differently. It impacts people living with disabilities differently. The whole notion of transition to an alternative energy, which is also a mitigation measure in itself, is not without its own adverse effects, also on vulnerable population. We talk about the issue of just transition, for instance, in the context of South Africa. When we're saying abandon coal, move to alternative source of energy, the question is, how just is this transition? Are people just going to, those who are working in coal-intensive, sectors, are they going to just, lose their job like that because we are transiting? Because bear in mind that some of these people lack the skills to, fit to this into this alternative, livelihood, and these are all urban and city issues that we need to deal with. And so there is a way, there's a need to see social security, in that context too, that it does not only respond to adaptation. I know I'm called upon to talk about adaptation today, but then I think it's also an important area that for future engagement, because it's also a very wide area when we talk about social security, particularly with reference to mitigation, in the context of energy transition and all. So I want to say that about that. Then the other one is about the ICT. It's so key. That's a very important question, and it's an important area to look at, because the ICT is when we talk about ICT, it's about access to information, and access to information is so key. it's an adaptation measures in itself, because it's not just about finances, it's not just about making resources available. Knowledge, as I did say in my presentation, is also a vital information that needs to be, circulated and shared and at a very important speed in the context of climate change. And you cannot do so meaningfully, effectively without ICT. You cannot do. People must receive, information as at when due. People must receive, reports on their electronic, programs needs to be developed to factor all that in. It's part of the resilient city that we're talking about, particularly when you look at the increasing populations in the urban setting and the increasing likelihood that they are going to be adversely impacted by climate change. So ICT becomes so key in terms of information sharing, and if information sharing is seen as an adaptation measure itself, then it's something that has to be taken seriously. So I will stop at that.
Thank you very much, Prof Jegede, and thank you for the inputs and insights. I think we now start our audience participation. So before I start to address the questions in the chat, I would like to give Professor Anel du Plessis an opportunity and ask if she has any insights or any inputs. Thank you.
Thank you, Melandri. I don't think I have any insights. I just really want to thank the two presenters. We need strong coffee for the things we are talking about today. I think we are dealing with sorry for the noise in the background, with a truly complex problem, in the sense that it's a wicked problem. Climate change is a grand challenge, if we can call it that. And I was hoping to perhaps, Prof Heever, Alex, get your view on whether or not you think that climate change might, over time, influence our understanding of social security and the current definition and interpretation. You've mentioned at the start of your talk the social context and the economic context. And I was wondering whether we would eventually also see the biophysical context featuring, to the extent that our understanding of the contingencies might also change. And I'm thinking of, in terms of the contingencies, for example, that rising living costs is, in my view, an inverse contingency, to the extent if we adapt to climate change and we start mitigating, that comes at a cost that's being rolled down to the man on the street. So I'm just wondering about that nexus, and whether in your field of study and research you see some changes around the thinking of what a social security system should respond to, also in relation to the impacts and the causes of climate change. And then, while I have the floor with all the noise in the background, Ademola, I was wondering also whether or not, in your perusal of the climate change policies and the draft bill, etc., whether we see a strong enough emphasis on poverty alleviation as an adaptation measure, if that's a priority of our government when we talk climate change. And I don't know if she's still with us, but Sue Marstel, who's also present here today in her PhD, also looks a little bit into that, not from a climate change perspective, but our government's perception of poverty and the role of poverty alleviation. And then I saw that Nicolene also raised it in the chat, and it was a burning question also on my side. You may have seen in the press quite a bit of critique around South Africa's submission to the United Nations Committee on Social, Cultural and Economic Rights recently, where it seems as if our government is very defensive in terms of what it is doing to address the socioeconomic conditions of our people, and that it's grasping at feathers, if you can call it that, also making a huge boo-ha around a universal basic income grant that might be coming. So if you could also respond to that, Prof Heever, I'll appreciate. Thank you very much.
The classic social security system itself it tends to be almost reactive to particular social contingencies, rather than in and of itself addressing the causes. That's not to say that its orientation and its structure, when you look at the extensions, the interrelated aspects of social security systems, can be used. Those structures can be used to address the causes, and I'll give you an idea where. So if you have to look at unemployment protection, classic unemployment insurance is a financial transfer for a limited period of time for people if they lose work. So in South Africa, it's just about 12 months maximum. Many countries actually have social assistance for people who are unemployed. And that social assistance is sometimes made conditional upon participation in what's referred to as labour activation programs. And those labour activation programs tend to articulate with industrial policy and strategy. And that's really where a link can come in, because you've got a combination of special employment programs in which you're financing people in employment. You can have reskilling arrangements. So if you're trying to establish, let's say, a climate change strategy, it involves principally a restructuring of our infrastructure. So you would, for instance, if you need to move toward a system that is less dependent on the motor car as a vehicle of transport, you have to go through a lengthy process of restructuring how you've invested in your transport systems and networks, potentially allowing people, for instance, to have shorter distances to travel, and distances that they can travel without using either bulk transport or a car. If you look at how Johannesburg and Pretoria and Cape Town are structured, you essentially can't get around without access to some sort of vehicle. And bulk transport is also not very efficient in the way it's designed. So we basically have climate insensitive transport networks. And our climate insensitive transport networks have also influenced where shopping centers are set up, how they are actually designed, how our workplaces are organized, and where our living areas are, and how people are spatially distributed. Now, all of that has basically then created a legacy infrastructure that has to change. Now, if you're looking at a 20-year time horizon and you're starting to connect it to the social security system, you can begin to actually connect your support structures, your employment support structures, toward the long-term investment restructuring that's required. It can be at two levels, both the actual specific employment as well as the new skills that are required for a completely different way of living. And that's so that needs to go together with, I think, the other key features of effective cities going forward, all of which require this investment. One is localization, is that you want to create environments which are less dependent at a local area on imports and exports alone, because that basically creates a higher contingent risk of unemployment if anything happens at another level of your system. But the more localized you are, the more resilient your community and your area is to employment security and decent work. So that's very important. That's transport systems, that's location of sites for employment, and housing development, so that you're looking at mixed socioeconomic areas that are developed. So the social security system can basically support people while they're going through that transition. It can also support people in the employment that they go into, making the infrastructural redeployment within society. So that I see as an important part of a wider strategy. But if you look at what you have to kind of integrate and coordinate, an aspect of industrial policy has to coordinate with city planning and design, and as well as with the social security system. So you really need quite strong platforms in each of those areas so that they can talk intelligently to each other and set up mechanisms. Because ultimately, as you realize any of those objectives, you have to have resources that are allocated and put behind them, otherwise they don't happen. So the planning doesn't have to be radical, but it says that you set a 20-year agenda to restructure your city design and your infrastructure and what your infrastructure. So now you don't say, well, we've got lots of cars on the road and they're always queuing to get off the highway. You now say, well, how can we reduce the number of cars on our roads by 60% by in the next 20 years? What do we have to do? We have to put people closer to where they work. We have to give them the opportunity to travel to work by bicycle, and not just as an upper income nice to have, but as something that everybody can access. And you also want to ensure that people can find work close to where they live, and it's easy for them to do that. So those are all the kinds of issues that are quite important to moving a system that is predominantly reactive, your social security system, to one where it starts to coordinate with the way in which the real part of our society and economy is restructured, so that the thinking starts to work together as opposed to being in the silos. On the issue of the 18 to 59, I mean, that is a proposal that's currently tabled to deal with the fact that we don't have any kind of unemployment social assistance in South Africa. And coincidentally, I'm chairing the expert panel evaluating of experts, basically economists, who are evaluating the viability of that kind of option for South Africa. But it is complex because we don't really have an unemployment support framework in South Africa. So theoretically, you shouldn't just design a support framework like that unless you're starting to articulate it with the kind of other issues that I've mentioned, which is you're bringing in the whole labor activation strategy and the sort of physical parts of redesigning both the economy in South Africa and the way that our society is organized physically. And within that respect, the issue of that long-term investment strategy and the physical structuring of our society does involve bringing down the cost of living for people in the way in which we've invested in everything from housing to transport, etc. So but it's complex, and because it's complex, you need to have an institutional governance framework that is equal to the complexity of the problem that you're dealing with. And it can't be decision-making that is reactive, short-term, and focused on quick gains. It's got to be one where you can make a 30-year commitment. You can establish that kind of direction, and you can have continuity of investment strategy on a long-term basis. We don't have that institutional framework at this point, which is why I will go back and say, it's the missing link. It's not the policies that you can come up with. It's the fact that we cannot actually have sustainable policy in an environment which doesn't have the institutions to back it up.
Thank you very, very much, and good luck with that work also on that committee. It can't be easy. That is definitely a difficult strategic decision to take moving forward. But thank you for the response. Appreciate it. Thank you, Melinda.
Thank you for those interventions. I would like to go to the chat box now for questions. So a similar question by Heloise and Felix to Prof Ademola on whether the government, and especially local government, has the capacity in terms of both financial and human resources and political will to implement the structure that you suggested towards the end of the presentation. And Felix adds on asking that it appears that capacity is one of the constraints faced by municipalities. Even though they have the legislative powers to make bylaws, municipalities do not always exercise this power, and not because they do not want to, but because they do not have in-house expertise and capacity for such. And then a very interesting question by you, Henry, to both Prof Alex and Prof Ademola, asking what do you think the contribution is that we as academics can make to improve or encourage in terms of facilitating an organized approach within government and other institutions to improve social security? Thank you.
Okay, So you want me to respond? So,
yes, please.
Yep.
Prof Ademola, if you could perhaps take the first question, and then Prof Alex van Heever could respond. Thank you.
Many thanks for the question. Particularly the one talking about the role of the academics in ensuring that, this change, institutional change that we're talking about is effected so that, climate change adaptation issues, not just climate change adaptation issues, even mitigation issues can well be addressed at the, can we address, structurally the way we want it to. So it's a very important question. I think I can identify two roles. One is what we're already doing, keeping the issues on the front burner, talking about it, and of course, making recommendations when we're called upon to do so at a different level. I think that is key. And the second thing I will say is that it's also very important too that we kind of as academia ensure that we make these issues as down to heart as possible. We don't get unnecessarily elitist about our recommendations on our direction, because these are life issues, and these are issues that affect even populations at different levels. So it's very important that we kind of make our suggestions and our recommendations as people friendly as possible. Because there is this dichotomy of shall I say gap, a dichotomy of understanding in relation to how the academia interfaces with decision makers. Decision makers want actionable recommendations that are clear, that can easily be followed through, short terms, long term basis. Academics, we like, and rightly so too, problematizing, and at times in doing so we lose focus of the subject of the matter, which is just that human livelihood needs to be improved and addressed. So I think we need to. So I'm speaking on the second point in relation to messaging. I think if I have to use one word to capture it, I would say messaging. Messaging is so key and critical in addressing these issues of climate change within the context of social security. I will stop at that. Yeah.
Okay. So should I respond to the municipality question? I think so. On municipalities having the capacity to sort of kind of adopt this sort of strategic redirection that I've suggested, I don't think that they have on their own. And there's a mixed bag of municipalities in South Africa. So currently there are weaknesses in the capabilities that are driven by aspects of our political dynamics that have gone wrong. Because the whole idea of essentially having a democratic governance model for municipalities is that they are responsive to their communities. Well, we haven't seen that effect. So there's a first problem in that there isn't a consistent orientation of municipalities to actually respond to the needs of their communities. And if you don't have that, you're not even going to solve the most basic problems, let alone the complex ones. So there is an issue of governance and how we deal with that that specific governance, just to do your job at the municipal level. In terms of the wider strategic direction, I didn't quite kind of get into how I'd look at a sort of structuring of decision making within, let's say, a provincial region and its connection to national functions. I think there's huge opportunity for saying, well, when you're dealing with certain parts, certain organizations, certain parts of a governance framework of a system, is that you can you can provide, first of all, the ideas for what needs to happen at a strategic level, at a different level of the system. Those ideas don't have to come from the province, from the municipality. They can become an implementing agent for an idea that's been developed somewhere else. So, so to the extent that we leave municipalities to come up with their own strategic ideas, they will tend to be, even in the best functioning, they will tend to, municipalities, they will tend to be parochial, they will tend to be highly local. But if you want something to be coordinated across multiple municipalities, you will have to use a higher level of strategic decision making. So what I would be suggesting is that these problems, because they are in many cases wicked problems, they're complex, they require strategic long-term thinking. You have to actually create an organization that does that, but it can't be an organization of straight bureaucrats. It can't be an organization that is very limited in the way in which it consults and engages on solving problems. So even in a badly functioning municipality, you're going to have information that's going to be highly relevant to strategic decision making. So a well-structured, more centralized organization that's generating the ideas for policy and strategic direction can actually be created at a central level. But in the design of the operationalization of those strategies, you will then use your organizations, such as your infrastructural development, provincial structures, use land regulation capabilities at a provincial level to articulate with land regulation at a municipal level. You can inspire policy change in terms of bylaws by actually driving them at a different level of the system if you've got the institutions that are kind of coordinating resources for strategic thinking at that level. So I strongly suggest the separation of two functions. That's the strategic thinking and the implementation, the actual operationalization of those strategies, the execution structures. So to the extent that you've got thinned out organizations in terms of strategizing, you can strategize very intelligently at another level of the system, but still operationalize through municipalities, through conditional allocations, through departments that aren't necessarily very good at strategizing, like, let's say, a provincial department of infrastructural development, which is much more oriented toward project management and driving projects, rather than thinking about what project they're running. Create the idea somewhere else. To allocate the resources behind that idea to those organizations and hold them to account for operationalizing it. It's that kind of structure that can allow for the development of more complex long-term strategies that are at a wider spatial level, but can bring together multiple organizations and local structures. That's kind of how I would think about trying to solve the problem of getting a much bigger idea into our wider spatial development.
Thank you very much for those very in-depth insights. I think it's very apparent from the discussions that when it comes to addressing social security and climate change adaptation, that there are a lot of things to consider. So I'll be closing the Q&A for now, and I'd like to welcome the speakers to provide any final inputs and any final thoughts before we close the event. Starting with Prof Jegede. Thank you.
Many thanks for giving me the floor. I think I found the interaction very useful and rewarding. I found the questions raised very instructive and also indicative that we have a very enlightened audience who knows what the issues are and what changes need to take place on the short term and the long term levels. I just want to say on my own part that it is important that we look at these issues, not just necessarily as an immediate challenge, but also as a future challenge. And it's also very important that we factor these approaches towards whatever solution we are designing, to respond to climate change adaptation and mitigation in urban setting. It is so crucial that we see it that way, because, as we have said, some of the government is often reactive. Some of the policy papers and all that are also reactive. They look at the issues, the problems that are already there, and now to solve it. They are not solving the problems very well too. But then, the issue of climate change goes far more than that. We need to start thinking in terms of future projections, where those who are going to lose their jobs, societies that will be even more impacted by climate change, exigencies in the future. I think all these things have to be part of our approach, in tackling the issue, and we can do justice to the subject if we only focus on, if we're only reactive or we're only reflective of existing problem, because the problems are going to come more, and they are not going to come in a way that we can easily also predict. And we need to kind of have whatever, we need to ensure that this predictability element features so visibly in interventions that we can anticipate or project for climate change adaptation challenges. And that is what I would argue, and that is some of the things I also try to push across in my submissions, for us to be a bit futuristic about it, and to accommodating about this important challenge that we are facing. So having said that, I think I have nothing more to add than that. Thank you.
Sorry, Prof Vandenjeper, I think your mic's still off. Thank you.
Sorry, apologies. Yeah, so a couple of points. I think the first issue, just on the sort of the role of academics, I think in this kind of conversation, is that there's a tendency that I've found for the sort of academic world to be structured around how government is structured. So if a particular department wants support from academia, it asks for that support in its silo. So the important thing is for actually the academic world to break the silos as well. That means it's got to develop a broader vision, and governments will react to that. They will respond, because now they're getting the insights from the academic platform. And so I think that is an important role that academia can play in areas where the mandates within government are inefficiently distributed and need to be rethought through. And that because of the fact that there's an inherent difficulty in government being able to restructure along those lines from within, it actually helps when it does come from without, in a coherent way and in a consistent way. Plus the academic platform is teaching people, and they go into government, and therefore the new ideas begin to change the way people think about their role and their mandate. So that's the first point. I think the other issue that's been missing, I think, for many years in the way people look at strategic policy, such as climate change or any major policy, is that one has to look at institutions. And one tends to focus on, well, what's the idea? What do we need to do? What's the specific policy? But the problem is that you're trying to throw that policy at a bad institutional framework that can't actually connect with it. And that becomes a problem. And that's why you can produce documents, reports, etc. Over and over again, and you don't really get government responding in a coherent way, even when it wants to. It's just not structured. It's not receptive. So in some ways, the institutional restructuring has to make government more receptive to the key strategic policies that need to change. Now, what does that restructuring require? That restructuring is largely about looking at how mandates are distributed within government. What are the institutions that are responsible for particular problems? And how do you structure mandates to go across silos? Because you don't just do it by saying all of you departments must think about this in your annual strategic plan. You'll get nothing out of that. You actually have to have a more structured approach in which you're addressing sort of within government transversal functions that are there. You need a different decision-making level that operates across departments, a kind of matrix structure that you might need to build for certain key policies. Because if it's not there, it won't be thought about. And as part of that structure, the problem is also the way in which the strategizing occurs within government. So strategizing is really where you start to think about really complex problems. And if you've got like 3 people dealing with the problem with maybe one sort of disciplinary background in government with a huge mandate, they will never actually understand all the issues around that. So the way in which you design processes to solve problems in government is very important. They tend to be multidisciplinary. Complex problems, wicked problems, require that you have a more engaging institutional response to the collection and focusing of information. It means you've got to go to more places. You've got to take in more information. You've got to be more open to critique and to building information into policy responses. So there isn't an ideal policy that comes from the perfect technical experts. It just doesn't exist. The process, well-designed processes actually get good policies. Now, we don't have that at the moment. So that's also a further institutional shift in the way that state organizations, which have the authority to deal with certain kinds of problems. And that authority is a really powerful lever. But their authority is very often backed up by poor institutional frameworks and very bureaucratic and top-down approaches to thinking about problems. That has to change. So that's where I say in thinking about the process by which these really complex problems are addressed means we've actually got to build an institutional framework that is equal to the nature of the problem. And until we do that, our resources will be misallocated. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much to Prof Jegede, and thank you very much, Prof Heever. You have left us with a lot to think about, and I think all of your insights and inputs definitely show why today's theme is such a relevant and such an important theme to talk about. So I will now hand off to Maricel, who will do the wrap up and the word of thanks.
Thank you so much, Melandri. We hope everyone found the discussion useful and interesting, and that it made you all think about the interaction between social security and adaptation measures to climate change in South African cities. It was a very enlightening discussion, and it really highlighted some of the very important issues faced in South Africa and elsewhere, I believe. And I think this conversation brought to light some of the very important shortfalls in the South African law and policy framework related to social security and its related systems, as well as the implementation thereof and the cardinal role that they play in environmental issues such as climate change and urban resilience, as well as improvement, along with addressing the many social economic disparities in South Africa as the most unequal country in the world. And I don't think the conversation stops here. And this is definitely a topic with more potential and a need for research due to the important aspects mentioned by the speakers. So first and foremost, I would like to thank the speakers, Prof Alex and Prof Ademola Jegede, for your time and effort in your presentations, as well as your interesting thoughts and inputs. Then I would also like to thank Melandri for moderating the session, and Prof Anel for opening the session for us, and also providing some insights. And then I want to thank especially Barnelli Anthony from our CLES team, who scheduled this meeting for us, and Nicoline for handling the registrations and most of the admin things behind the convo. And then also the critical conversation team, who did so much work behind the scenes. Thank you, team, so much for all your assistance. We appreciate it greatly. And most of all, thank you to one and every participant for your participation today and for your interaction with the speakers. We hope that you will join us for the next critical conversation, and we'll let you know when that is. And we look forward to engaging with you at future events. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you and bye. Thanks.
Bye, everyone. Stay safe.